Oh, sorry, I got put off by that.
Yeah, I don't blame one.
Right, let's try that again. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Devon and Cornwall Record Society's chat about its Lex volume. My name's Catherine Rider. I'm the honorary editor for the Devon and Cornwall Record Society, and over the last year or so, I've been working with Dr Jill Cobley, who is editing our 2022 volume on James Davidson's East Devon Church Notes. Davidson was a 19th century antiquarian who visited many, many churches in Devon and wrote some very detailed descriptions. It's a really interesting volume that tells us a lot about church history, but also, as we'll see, a lot about family history, social history, and life in the time. So I'll kick off by introducing Jill and asking, how did you come to be interested in Davidson?
Thank you, Catherine. When I finished my PhD, I really needed a challenge in life because, I just needed to do something. And I happened to tell this to Todd Gray and John Allen, and they both suggested that I transcribed James Davidson's church notes. I hasten to add only volume 5, which is East Devon Churches, because there are five volumes in his set, and they cover 499 churches in Devon. But I had, in actual fact, learnt about Davidson from Tony Roos, who used to work in the Devon Record Society library that used to be in the old library in the centre of Exeter, because I was looking at Peter Orlando Hutchinson's diaries in there. And he said, did I know about Davidson? And I said, no, I have no idea. And it was absolutely fascinating. It opened another world. These 5 volumes are all about blue bound, which Davidson must have done in actual fact, because when you open the book and look at the pages, and they're all handwritten on slightly bluish paper, they are obviously at one time were folded into 3, because on the back of the fold is the name of the church, the name of the village, because Davidson only put the name of one church in these notes, and that was Kilmington Church. The rest of them were just like Ball Cliss, St Mary, and that was all. But at some time he'd kept them obviously in a drawer, and then he'd had them bound, because everyone is indexed and page numbered, and then within the index, besides the person's name, you also have things like various things within the church, or like the yew trees in the churchyard he mentions, or the robin that nested in one of the churches, in one of the altars. So that was how I started off, because Davidson really's accounts are an eyewitness account of what a church looked like before Victorianization. So I think that was really how I started and how I became so interested.
And yes, and you've touched on this a bit already, but what does Davidson's text tell us that we might not know otherwise?
Right. Besides, we go in a church today and we think it looks exactly the same as it's always looked, but it does not. There are churches that you could go to that Davidson went to, that are exactly the same. Escott Church is one of those. Davidson's description is word for word what you'd see in there, because that was built within his lifetime. The same as the church in my village in Tipton, St John, that was built within his lifetime. And he tells about how he came on the railway line that came to Tipton and actually looked. Sorry, I've muddled that up. Right, let's be honest here. I muddled that up because it's Peter Orlando Hutchinson, who was my first hero in life. He went by train to look at Tipton St George. I don't know how Davidson went to Tipton Church, but that doesn't matter. Both of them could walk in there today and see it exactly the same as they described it. So going back to Davidson after that, the biggest thing I think is what is missing and has changed is the memorials. We know Davidson recorded them in a church. He does write sometimes. There was obviously a very long laudatory inscription, and I didn't copy it all. And you think, was that the end of the day, or it was just too many words and he couldn't write it all down. But it tells us all about the people and their social life within there. We also know whether, just digressing a little bit, whether the pulpit had been moved from one side of the church to the other, whether it had had a sounding board. Ottery St Mary Church had a sounding board above the altar. That's gone, but the angel he talked about is you can still find in Ottery Church, but it's totally on the other side of the chancel. And Ottery Church is another one. Fonts. Now you often hear about the fonts being changed. Ottery St Mary had a very small plain one. Now it is an enormous, large square marble font on marble pillars and a big wood cover to the font. And often he talks about two fonts. I mean, Sidmouth at one time had no font, and all it had was a wooden basin that was kept in a cupboard. Branscombe Church had a new font, and they were given, they only had a basin. And yet Teignmouth Church in the 1900s, when 1910, 1920, they gave them the new font. So whether they had two fonts in their church, I don't know. But returning to the memorials, I mean, nearly over 700 are missing. But when you say it like that, it doesn't sound very many from 110 churches. But we need to remember that 5 churches were built within Davidson's lifetime. 42 were rebuilt. And Sidmouth was a classic example of that, because it is Hutchinson this time. He did record the whole destruction of Sidmouth Church, and he bought part of the chancel and had it rebuilt for his home, and which he enlarged and lived in. 58 churches were restored, but it seemed to me that the churches that were restored suffered the most destruction and the most loss of memorials. I mean, Sidmouth Church lost 135 memorials. I mean, that is an enormous number to lose out from a church. And I always feel very sorry because, all right, I know it's the elite and the middle class who could afford to buy a memorial. But when you think of all the money they spent on a memorial, and there it is gone, and there's no trace of those people at all. And 7, as I said, 7 churches in East Devon were totally rebuilt, and some have been rebuilt since that again. But that's what they did to a church, because it was the parishioners who wanted their church to look better than the next village. So therefore, they were prepared to raise and spend the money on the church building. Within the memorials, we know that over 1,000 husbands were recorded, but only 700 wives were recorded. But I think the saddest ones are the children, and particularly when you transcribe it and you see the children that died year in, year out, or perhaps 2 or 3 in a year. And there was one memorial, and I can't remember quite which church it was, where it wrote about the mother could stand it no longer, so she departed this life. It was so sad to transcribe those words. And then we had another 400 men and 400 women, but you didn't know if they were married or single because it doesn't tell you that in the memorial. But on the memorials, we have so much evidence of the social life that went on in Devon. I mean, we had 200 odd who were squires or the gentry, and then another 42 who were titled. And we had 48 people who had been in the military, but I classed that as army and the navy. But we had 158 rectors recorded. And so you can understand why the rector wanted to have his name in the church. We had mayors and yeomans, merchants, serge makers. And when you think back to Todd's book on the cloth trade, we have evidence of some serge makers in Devon there, and medical and titled people. And then the odd ones that were fascinating: a bookseller, a draper, 2 salt officers, which were in Seaton where they had salt beds. We had quite a few people who were shipwrecked and died abroad, but they had a memorial, particularly in Topsham Church. An artist, a harbour master, an American, particularly, you know, he was an American, an art master, a fisherman, and an innkeeper. And we had town criers and clothiers, and we did have 4 MPs. So it shows that Devon was not a backwater. We had a wide range of people who lived in East Devon or who wanted their memorial in East Devon Churches because they might have died elsewhere. So I think that's what these records tell us about Devon churches.
And it was a huge undertaking for Davidson, especially with 19th century travel conditions, to get around all these churches and take the notes he did. And what do we know about him as a person or about his working methods?
There is so little, but perhaps this book will turn up some information, hopefully, about him. Because in his other books, he writes about, there's nothing personal about Davidson, except I did find one quote that he wrote, and he said, Davidson described his work, and this was both, I assume, but it doesn't say so, it could be the church or his archaeological interest, because this quote comes from the book he wrote about Axminster, as an agreeable occupation on many an interval of leisure amidst the duties and enjoyment of domestic and rural life. And that's the only really personal thing he ever writes. I mean, he does write when he goes to Linton and Lynmouth over there that he had to have a guide because he would not have found his way there. But Davidson does not describe the exterior of a church. So when you arrive at a church, you have no idea what you're going to expect. You know it's a tower and you know which end the tower is. He concentrates on the interior of the church, and all East Devon churches are described in the same manner, and the other 300 in the other books. He always talks about, he gives the measurements. Now, I did check the measurements, not religiously, just by pacing it out, but they are more or less the same. And he talks about the position of the fixture and fittings. He talks about the memorials. And he often tells you about the floor, because he tells you in North Devon about the tiles. And there were tiles makers in the Middle Ages in Barnstable area that made the tiles, and they were itinerant workers. And you can trace the areas that they covered with the tiles. And sadly, they've gone. The only place that I know there's still medieval tiles is a church the other side of the ex-estuary, and I cannot remember the name, but that's the only place that I know that was still a lot of medieval towers, of floor tiles. He tells us, he talks a lot about the silver plate within a church. Now, whether it was on show in those days, I don't know. But when the Reverend Chanter, who carried out a survey of the church's silver, he sent a questionnaire out, and he was not satisfied with the clergy because they didn't put on the hallmark of the top of the pattern and the pattern itself. So he went round and looked at them. But Davidson, in actual fact, recorded every single item. And now they were the same as when Chanter went there, but Chanter did not do all the churches in East Devon. Whether they're still there in the church, I don't know. I didn't go and check on the silver because I felt that was not quite the thing, and you didn't want people turning up at a church looking for silver, not in this day and age. I think, I don't know if I mentioned it, I think the 2 churches or 3 churches in Devon stand out. The Tractarian principles of putting the church back how it was with a raised front. Soughton Church is a classic example, beautifully restored exactly to the Tractarian principles with the raised altar and the steps and everything else. Honiton Church was destroyed by fire. The first fire was in after Hutchins had been there before 1900. They restored the church, but then the church was again destroyed by arson in 1911. But we have Davidson's account of what was originally there. And Cliff St. George was the other church that stands out. It's not the only one in Devon, but it was bombed in the Second World War. And we have Leighton's pictures in the book, and it shows what the destruction looked, or how the church looked when it was destroyed. And again, it wasn't restored, but to a much simpler or rebuilt until the late 1950s.
Well, that's wonderful.
But personal, I know nothing. I'm sorry, can't fill you in. He always strikes me as a meticulous man, enormous attention to detail, but human, not stuffy or open to ideas.
Yes, he must have been, yes, certainly meticulous to work in the way he did over what must have taken him many, many years. Well, thank you. That's a wonderful kind of overview of Davidson, what we know about him and what we don't know about him, but also his books. And I think this is a text that should interest many of our members. As I said, this is our volume. I think I misspoke earlier. It's our volume for 2021. It's coming out in the spring of 2022. It'll be the volume sent to our Devon and Cornwall Record Society members. If you want to join us, go and look on our website, devonandcornwallrecordsociety.co.uk. It will also be for sale at a higher price through Boyd Ellen Brewer. And so watch this space come March 2022 when it will be out. Thank you very much, Jill.
Thank you, Catherine, very much.
Sorry, did I cut you off?